I got together with a group of retail thought leaders in March 2020 and said, look, what does this all mean, this lockdown? And how are retailers going to react to this? And we developed a three-step approach. The first one was focus in the short term would be just do it, which would be getting the shelves full, get the e-commerce functionality working, scaling it as quickly as possible to prevent zero revenue. While that was going on, the second stage should have been to collect their brightest people and ask them to develop capabilities that they may need to allow, as their consumers' needs were changing, capabilities that could be adapted to allow them to continue to service their customers with their emerging needs. And the third stage, which would have been at the point where we perhaps relaunched our brand rather than just reopen the doors, would be to discard the old and adapt the new. I'd be guilty of thinking that was just a step change, that we go into the pandemic, we do this work, we make a transformational change, it's a step up, and then we go to another plateau. I actually think that we're on a staircase, and our ability to get in front of this is we have to accelerate our ability to continuously transform. If we go back only a handful of years, we'd say, oh, we have continuous improvement, we have business transformation, and we have reinvention. I think the business transformation is now, we've crossed through the continuous improvement and actually go to continuous business transformation. So in my mind, an acceleration of that process, rather than going straight, step, straight, we're actually on almost a diagonal path upwards.
Welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you're on Eastern time, if you're on UK time, good evening. And if you're on Pacific time, good morning still. So we're going to talk about strategic planning in an uncertain and volatile retail environment. I'd like to, for people who aren't directly in retail, just actually scratch off retail and just go business environment to make sure everybody's got a stake in this conversation. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior exec on call, specializing in rapid performance improvement across retail supply chains and the last mile. What I do is to work with boards and business leaders to help them navigate disruption, which I've been doing for the best part of 30 years, and reinvigorate supply chain performance, which I've been doing for an equal time. My purpose in life is to help business leaders, particularly in retail and the consumer products flow of things, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. But it could be pretty much any business transformation at a time. I've worked in different roles on an interim contract basis. Thank you so much for attending, and hopefully you'll all get some great value from this. I will say I'm going to pitch this at quite a high level. Many of you may have been involved in detailed strategic planning. Some of you may have been on the periphery. Some of you may not have had too much experience of this. So I'm keeping it high level to be of value to everybody. So is business adaptability key to creating competitive advantage? So just looking at the agenda for today, I'm going to go through it in broadly 5 sections. We're going to do some scene setting, share some reflections around the pandemic. look at different planning approaches and maybe touch on their outcomes, look at roadblocks and the tactics of actually getting this into place. And then we're going to break into a general discussion, depending on how we go and how we make progress during this session. As we looked at going into the first lockdown, I don't know if you're particularly aware of the language that most people were using, certainly those people who were working through the early stages of that lockdown. There was a use of words such as pivoting, and that one really stuck in my throat a lot, resilience, agility. We suddenly discovered halfway through March, we became agile, we became very resilient, and we were pivoting all over the place. And I would like to position that pivoting statement to be like, we already had operating capabilities or capacities, and we just moved up the continuum a little bit more. And suddenly we perhaps convinced ourselves we were doing something quite different to what we did before, but we perhaps we weren't. We were just doing a little bit of an extension from what we were doing. But as we tried to pile into that, we found ourselves in a bit of a firefight. We found that we couldn't necessarily get beyond what we were doing. So we started to throw resource at it, which was really doing more of what we were doing in, say, 2019, rather than rethinking this problem. And we found that the more disruption we experienced, the more confined perhaps we felt, and we were like stuck in the mud. We couldn't make the progress we wanted. And during that process, depending on where you were in terms of the company's experience and recognition of this natural progression of going from, yeah, we're on top of this, to no, we're not, we're drowning in the mud, is that there would have been a reality check. And the reality check said, what might we need to do around here to survive this? And maybe another question would be, beyond surviving, what would we need to do to get beyond this? Some companies were already well positioned. I would point to companies like Amazon. Their issue with the first lockdown is they already had a program of moving from 2-day service to 1-day service, or 1 day into some SKUs on same-day basis. They were transitioning their whole operation across North America to that situation. I think the pandemic just run interference over that. So he went from, just about getting to next day service to next month service. But very quickly they started to regain ground. As far as I'm concerned, if they have a stock, they still are able to maintain next day service for me. So here, this is a graph of, as down the bottom, as the disruption gets more intense, we need to find ways of providing either options, and we might describe that as being agile in our business, but we're looking at options. How do we move from one state to another state relatively easy? We don't have to go through a firefight to be able to make that transition. I've got a couple of reflections here. The first one is that, I'm hoping that most people can reflect on this period and realize that for many, many years, even decades, our whole business design or supply chain designs have been around constructing a business model, set of processes, systems based on single figure annual growth rates. Of course, there's some businesses that are small, grow fast, but if you look at the sort of mid-sized to large companies, if they're growing 2 to 3% per year, their shareholders are relatively happy with that performance. And if you're facing a 2% growth and your investors are expecting a 10, 15% growth of profitability, your attention is driving costs out of your business. And the way that you approach that may be quite, in some ways, reckless, because you're just looking at maybe a silo or just within your company and just trying to take costs out. And sometimes it's regardless of the consequences, because you have to make the next quarter, the next year's profitability. I think that the pandemic's actually started to create a degree of wobble in that way of looking at the world. All I've seen is a philosophy of getting through, especially from the companies that haven't already made some progress on trying to equip themselves for the digital future, of which the pandemic's just tended to throw cold water on anybody who wasn't already started to progress down this. So I've seen getting through versus building the adaptability, the ability to move effortlessly from one situation to another. And the third thing, and I think it's only come to me more recently, as we went into the lockdown, there's at least one or two people here, perhaps from that group. I got together with a group of retail thought leaders in March 2020 and said, look, what does this all mean, this lockdown? And how are retailers going to react to this? And we developed a three-step approach. The first one was focus in the short term would be just do it, which would be getting the shelves full, get the e-commerce facility functionality working, scaling it as quickly as possible to prevent zero revenue. So they had to work really hard to keep some aspects of revenue going. While that was going on, the second stage should have been, and it wasn't always this way, should have been to collect their brightest people and ask them to develop the capabilities that they may need to allow, as their consumers' needs were changing, to develop capabilities that could be adapted to allow them to continue to service their customers with their emerging needs. And the third stage, which would have been at the point where we perhaps relaunched our brand rather than just reopen the doors, would be to discard the old and adapt the new. Now, I'd be guilty of thinking that was just a step change, that we go into the pandemic, we do this work, we make a transformational change, it's a step up, and then we go to another plateau. I actually think that we're on a staircase, and our ability to get in front of this is we have to accelerate our ability to continuously transform. If we go back only a handful of years, we'd say, oh, we have continuous improvement, we have business transformation, and we have reinvention. I think the business transformation is now, we've crossed through the continuous improvement and actually go to continuous business transformation. And so in my mind, an acceleration of that process, rather than going straight, step, straight, we're actually on almost a diagonal path upwards. When we turn our attention to our previous and maybe even current business planning tools, we will have probably all been involved in some shape of traditional business planning, which will be typically, going back to the earlier point of, saying 2% growth plus a stretch. Maybe there might be some bundled into that, some capital expenditure to try and take us into maybe a slightly different product group or marketplace, or get more of the same market. And the next one would be zero-based budgeting. And if anybody's ever experienced that firsthand, that's a pretty tough situation to live around, because basically we say everything's going back to zero, and you have to justify, if you're going to come forward with your budget, you're going to have to justify that in detail, rather than saying that, well, you spent this much last year and you used X number of people. What's your plan for this year? We need another couple of people because there's extra demand. And it's sort of nodded through. And a slightly more sophisticated version of the first is the current markets and current products planning. But it's broadly to do with a current business. And I'm just going to share a slide now to put this in the context of what I'm trying to describe. If we look at this graph, we've got the current categories and new categories on one side, and segments on the x-axis with current and new. So most of our focus over the last, say, decade has been really focusing on the bottom left-hand corner, the current business. So it's like, how do we get more customers of a defined segment? How do we maybe extend our products slightly? But what we're not always talking about is how do we get into brand new segments or brand new products? Or even more challenging is how do we get into new products with new customers, new customer segments, sorry, and how do we get to be in a very diversified portfolio of propositions? And most people would only think about that in terms of an acquisition. They wouldn't naturally say, get up one day and say, hey, we've been really good at doing this for the last 20 years. Let's do something completely different. And let's go into a market we know nothing about. So I just want you to have this picture in your mind, because I'm going to refer to it later in this presentation. But I would ask the question, and I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, but how reliable have these forecasts been during disruption? And I would just like draw the analogy of the buyer in Loblaws for toilet rolls. For 20 years, if he or she's been in that job for 20 years, they've probably had the simplest job in the world. They know it's a staple product with a very stable demand, hardly any seasonality. And all of a sudden, the volume's gone up by 500, 600, 700%. You have a problem with supply. The customers are ripping it from your shelves as soon as it appears anywhere. And then the CFO turns around and says, oh, we need to reforecast to see where we are. And they point to you and say, well, come on, toilet roll buyer, tell us what the future looks like. And they go, honestly, I can't use any of this data. And even this data I'm experiencing now, it doesn't really give me much guidance as to what the future might look like. And I think that I've used the toilet roll thing because it's quite an extreme case of disruption. But I think that for most categories, for most product lines, the plans of up to March 2020 have probably been fundamentally reshaped by the lockdowns, restrictions, and all the other disruptions that we've subsequently encountered. I want to introduce very briefly, and I refer to the thing at the bottom of the slide with Jim Tompkins. He issued a YouTube video back in June 2019, which I think is probably worth a visit to. Go to it for about 11 minutes before it goes into a sales pitch, but it really describes some of the challenges that we were seeing even in 2019. This is way before the pandemic, way before the Suez Canal and the storms and port closures and stuff that's disrupted even the pandemic's impact. But basically he was saying that, much as I've said so far, is the historic approach was we built linear models. It was very straightforward. We didn't experience as much disruption, but there was quite a lot of, I would say, clues that disruption was going to happen. You know, consumers would suddenly move from going into the store and buying what was on the shelf to using the internet through apps, etc., to find what they wanted and then buying it in that way. Media was changing, the impact of media was changing. There were so many other things going on just at a kind of subliminal level, and all of a sudden the pandemic happened and it threw everything up in the air. The current approach has been for companies to be in various stages of recognition that things are like substantially changed, because I think that many companies are seeing the disruption as a means to an end. We have to solve this disruption rather than solving our business model problem. But a future approach must, given how much disruption we've already experienced, and I have to put my marker in the ground and say we've had 18 months of pandemic disruption. I actually think we're only halfway through. That's a slight revision to my previous position, which was back in October, I said this is going to last until summer 2022. But I'm starting to think that because the disruption is coming at us in waves, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, the next week, but it's going to disable further our ability to move things around the globe efficiently. So we need options. Jim describes this as anti-brittle designs. He's specifically talking about supply chains, but again, we can just lift it up and talk about the business, or we can actually go down into the detail of supply chains and think about what would we need to have in our supply chain, our capabilities and our capacities that would allow us to move into different markets, into different products or services, and create a winning position out of that rather than getting stuck in the mud. I'm going to take it at a fairly high level, but these are the 6 steps to try and exert some control over the level of unprecedented, unpredictable uncertainty that we're experiencing. The first one is to actually identify the business risks, because I don't think generally companies have a huge amount of appetite for doing this, because if they were, they might actually, how we're going to do this, there's just so much so much risk out there which could materialize into issues that we have to deal with. I think the general approach for many businesses is to wait for it to happen. Let's not plan for that, because it's not going to. It's not happening, is it? No, right. Let's not plan for it. In fairness, we are resource constrained, so we can't tackle everything on the planet. What we can do is what's in front of us. So identifying the key risks. For instance, in Canada, we've got a federal election in 20 days now. That might be a change of government. That might lead to certain other policy decisions. It may be the same government gets a majority. There's a big risk, and how does that impact on our business and on our current situation? And underneath that is opportunities. And that way of thinking about what's risk and being able to scale that in terms of like make sure we've got a good grasp of all the business risks that we're facing is to be able to create multiple bold futures. So if this risk happens, what opportunity opens up within that risk for us to exploit? And then alongside that, then we have to start scheduling requirements. Some of these things we can do from where we are, but often we may have to then create capital programs to actually create the capacities and capabilities to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. And I'm going to come back to explain a little bit more detail about what that means. The next one is to prioritize these bold futures. So you're actually picking which risks you are going to respond to, which kind of futures you're going to develop. And also what the trigger or the metric is, that if a certain thing hits this metric, then that would be our invitation to move to the bold future. And then we have to develop that, I call it the common platform requirements, which is to actually, what are they? Say if we're in a third party business, we may say that we have got 1 million square foot warehousing capacity, but because of these types of risks we're facing, the bold future we're painting out for ourselves, we actually need 1.5 million, and it needs to be racked in a different way. It needs different handling equipment. So we need to develop what that requirement is, and then go out, roadmap that investment, and go out and do a big build program for things which may or may not materialize. They haven't materialized yet by definition of it being a risk rather than an issue, but we definitely need to make some progress on investing in those extra capabilities and capacities. So looking at scheduling requirements, this is a real hard work piece, which is for every bold future, we need to actually conduct a full SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, both where we are now, current, and also the desired position we need to be in with this bold future. In the context of a competitive environment that we will have either now or projected with geopolitical, economic, social, technology, legal, environmental, and now activism. I think that for people not putting activism on their effective overall SWOT analysis, that would be a trip over point to watch out for. Then we have to develop a business plan for each one of these bold futures. That might actually limit how many we consider, because this is a big piece of work, and we have to go out and list the capacities and capabilities that would support the business plan and achieving that bold future. And there may be some risks that we have to say around that. And then we have to rank the profitability, identify those triggers very clearly in the metric that we might choose to say, if it hits this, then we know that the risk is coming up and it's going to turn into an issue in a certain period of time. So we will now switch into this bold future. And we have to establish the kind of likelihood of where we are. How likely is this risk going to develop into an issue? So some of the roadblocks along the way of this process, and we're going to come into the implementation shortly, is it's a really tough piece of work to do for most teams. Often they can be fearful of doing it or just afraid of doing it. They may not have the technical skills to be able to look across the business, look at risks. It's not a natural process to look at risk. You have to have a certain mindset to be able to do that. There may be a hierarchical pressure within the organization. We're talking here about the norm of one vision. Often the CEO has been brought in or has cultivated support for a certain way of looking at the world, a certain aspiration to one goal, one vision. And of course, the scenario plan is actually saying, well, we have to look at alternatives here now. We're in this massive period of disruption. We don't know if we're going to survive, if we're going to win, if what. So we need to look at different options and then build ourselves up to be able to exploit those options when they arise. And it often requires not only objectivity and critical analysis skills, because there's a lot of work and there's a lot of data and stuff that needs to be looked at and reviewed, but also the ability to influence change. And it's often best suited to an external consultant, whatever it might be, for a couple of reasons. So can you imagine if you're a VP of strategy and you may or may not be inside the C-suite and in that kind of a position, and your job is to actually challenge the CEO, and that would be quite an interesting discussion to have. And you may have strong emotional intelligence and you may be quite independently minded, but at the end of the day, the CEO will just turn around and say, look, we're on this path, we're going here. That's what I've been spending out, years trying to tell the investors we're going here, and now we're in disruption and we're still going here. So that would be an interesting discussion to have, and that's the reason why I say that it'd probably be best for an external party to actually do the hard work and also try to exert influence on the organization to allow them to move forward. Many tools are stuck in silos and they do a great job tactically, demand management, inventory management, workflow planning, these kind of things, but they are in that box of current business. And while we're looking at things outside the current box, typically those tools will tend to help us stay in that box and will limit our ability to look outside. And the other thing, many of us will have been involved in capital plans where people propose certain things, and the first thing you want to say is, what's the return on investment here? I can't spend a couple of $1 million just on a whim. What's the return on capital employed? And it normally kills quite a lot of projects off, which could move businesses forward. And this scenario planning is quite the opposite of, let's call it the sweat the asset mentality, which is, my job is to cut costs out, to save capital, to ration resource. And the thought of me spending $2 million on something which may or may not happen, although it's got a business plan, etc., is like an anathema to me. So in terms of the implementation, again, quite high level, we have to assess the ability of the organization to adapt, the adaptability gap. And there is an adaptability quotient matrix figure, which I tend not to follow the maths of. But we have to examine when risks have been recognized, if they are recognized, what happens inside the organization? Is it just heads down, keep going, don't worry, it won't happen, we'll deal with it when it comes? Or is there an actual process, an embedded process, which does help to gather risk, and it's regularly reviewed by the top team, and they're actually thinking about not the totality of risks and what they need to do to get ahead of the risk, and whether or not they see often there's opportunities in these risks and they're motivated towards making changes or not. Another area which we're going to explore a little bit further is engaging stakeholders. When we look at why projects fail, why big transformational programs fail, often it's because the CEO doesn't sign up to the great plan, it didn't get the support of, and you can report after report that reflects that. But more often than not, I think that it's the people, the team, the individual who's looking after the project, who's managing that project, doesn't actually identify the stakeholders before he or she even starts a project, because it's really important for us to understand who they are so we can engage with them. And as I say, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. We have to create business specific template that's more the admin around this process. We conduct the 6-step scenario planning process, and then we check in with the stakeholders regularly. So identifying stakeholders is one of those things that often gets overlooked. If you're a project manager and you've gone through PMP, it's one of the first things you have to do on the project, even before you start writing the Gantt chart. Identify the stakeholders and try, and depending on how many you identify, it could be a list of 100, it could be a list of 20, it could be smaller than that, bigger than that. You either have to group them together and then look at their likely impact on the project, whether or not they're positively disposed towards the success of the project, or they're going to throw mud at every step you make. You have to make that kind of classification, but that's not static. You do that as you start the project, but you have to monitor that inclination towards the project that you're managing. Is it develop a communications plan, which is normally a document which details how you're going to handle each group, let's call it group of stakeholders, how you're going to handle variation of behavior towards a project. People move around in companies. Sometimes they get promoted, but they grab some of the responsibilities they had. And whereas when they were in this role, they were probably quite positive because it was change. But now they're in a different role. They may have a very different position on this project and may want to, as I said earlier, throw mud at things that they only a few months ago they were championing along and clapping along. And you have to deliver the messaging consistently. So whatever that messaging is, reporting where we are, etc. And then monitor, as I said, monitoring the changes in people's or stakeholders' personal agendas. Are they going to get in the way? Have they gone indifferent? And the communication plan should identify the steps you need to take as interventions when, it's sometimes easier to spot somebody who's really positive or really negative, but it's those ones in the middle that seem to be indifferent, but they can really unhinge a project very quickly. Normally, in terms of stakeholders, we have a kickoff meeting. We engage with the stakeholders as a group. We explore the scenario planning idea, the benefits of it, the approach, the work plan, the timescales, the why are we doing this. Maybe if we're adventurous, we might say this project might be into multi-millions and it may have these broad outcomes, because we can perhaps have an idea of what they might be, but right now we don't know what they are because we've got to work through the SWOT analysis and the analysis of risks. Then we take them through the bold future evaluation and analysis, where actually, when we've crammed it down to a handful that we can manage, we actually talk them through the steps we took and how we arrived at these futures, and therefore the spillover of that into the investment plans. What do we need to do to our current company to make sure it's ready for these bold futures, and we can switch from one to the other as the triggers being hit. And then we have to give them regular updates on the execution approach, which does actually include the thing that we described as a trigger, the metric or whatever it is, however we describe that. Is that still relevant to our device to effectively a go, no-go decision? Is that still positioned correctly? And how are events unfolding against that trigger? Are we coming close to it, or are we still way off and we've got some time before we have to transition to one of the bold futures? So that's broadly the end of what I've got to say today, but I want to do a quick exercise for people who want to participate. I want to put 3 very sort of high-level risks on the table and just see if we want to have a discussion just for 5 minutes on any one of these. So could I invite you just to write 1, 2, or 3 into the chat, and then we'll work out which one we just want to talk about. And we don't have to make it specific to your business unless you want to, but just to talk about some broad issues around that and what it might mean for a category or an industry.
It's George. Do you think that, actually, I believe that marketplaces are going to be oversaturated at some point. So I'm curious to just how well that plays out in the consumer market. And at the end of the day, DTC is interesting, but that means eliminating more retailers out of the proposition for me.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually, George. It's going to affect retailers. It's going to affect I believe, overall customer experience. I'm not sure which way. I'm not thinking it's going to be toward the better. It'll become more transactional, I guess. And it'll affect the landscape in terms of physical footprints of retail, Main Street, in malls, etc. So yeah, I do think it's going to affect that in a negative way, but it's a huge trend that's going on right now.
Yeah.
So it was a business or retail conversation quite early on. I think it might be number 2 or number 5, whichever one was, with Marina Strauss on it. And I did suggest that in the future, maybe much the same as Martin Christopher might have said in 1992, when he said, in the future, organizations won't compete, but supply chains will. I think similarly, now we're in 2021, we might actually say in the future, maybe marketplaces may compete. And if that's the case, what might that mean to retailers who maybe have a marketplace not doing too well, or don't have a marketplace, so they haven't got anything to scale, or already have a very established marketplace like Walmart or Amazon, but really maybe that's not a channel for some products to go down. So as we start to talk about a risk, we start to expand it pretty quickly and start to think about where are the opportunities, what might we need to think about as we think about this specific risk, where does it lead us in terms of our thought patterns? And then we would start to, as we move into the scheduling requirements, if we could develop a bold new future in this, what might we have to do with our current infrastructure, our buildings, our operating model, whatever it might be, to actually move towards something which would recapture market or take us into new segments or allow us to bring in different products in, different categories in to meet those kind of requirements and actually help us move to new segments, new products, to a position of diversification. Thanks for Nicholas.
Sorry, Gary, Ken here. It's more of a question, not related to the DTC, but looking at it from a broader perspective. From a business point of view, increasing penetration of any business, whether it's a service offering, right, that one is providing in today's environment, and because that it is a challenge everywhere, right? I mean, it's not only penetration of DTC, but I think when we look at the services side of the industry, is it fair to say that the more online, this presence that the service providers have and they differentiate themselves, then that's one perhaps way of mitigating that risk. I know we are not in this solution mode here, but I'm just thinking out loud, more from a service-oriented business perspective, how we might be able to, I think, will be impacted the same degree as the other conversations we're having right now.
Yeah. I think the question was if the consumers move more towards online, course marketplaces make that more doable, what steps can we take to differentiate ourselves? Was that the essence of the book?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you have a brand which is differentiated, but when you actually skipping across applications, there's only one thing to differentiate yourself on. weirdly, price. Well, at the moment it's stock availability, but assuming that you can find something that has stock, and it's the same component, so it has the same spec. The online world is driven typically by price in terms of differentiation, unless somebody can figure out, and this exercise might take us down that path, how can we differentiate ourselves online? How do we set our stall out properly beyond we've got the stock and here's a price?
Yeah, I think demography comes into play here. But yeah, probably Gen Z, Gen Y, millennials might be a little bit more forgiving. In fact, they might even expect it more, although there is a section of them that do like in-store, contrary to a lot of reports out there. But because of the pandemic, there are a lot of older cohorts that have adopted online e-commerce for purchasing habits. Generally speaking, it's more transactional. Is there room online for there to be innovative ways of better retail or customer experience? Absolutely, but I don't see it right now. But I think on the brick side of things, you have a lot more creativity, a lot more opportunity to differentiate yourself beyond price. Because if you're just competing on price, well, that's short-lived. And maybe in a value-based period right now because of COVID, where people are price sensitive, that'll live and help you as a business. But mid to long term, I don't think it's gonna. That's a pretty scary prospect to depend just on price.
Now, I come from the premium sector and luxury sector, and I can tell you that you can't associate experience with anything inexpensive or price. It doesn't work. The two never, they collide. They never actually merge. And today, when I look at the marketplace, I'm asking myself, what does experience really mean in a marketplace where everybody wants convenience, they want speed, they want price? Well, it becomes an expectation, particularly online. I'm browsing, I'm looking for a product. I may be moved by a brand. If I'm looking for a stove, or in my case, a barbecue that I have to wait till next year for now. That can change rather quickly because you have a need. Your expectation is that you have a need right now. And the model that you were looking for or the brand you were looking for can change quite quickly as well. So the dynamics with e-commerce are very different than in a personal service world. But again, you've got a ton of competition. I'm going to go back to the marketplaces. I don't know how they're all going to survive. There's going to be more of them. It makes no sense to me. But the DTC one, yeah, the brand manufacturers are great. The other side of the coin. So the dynamics of the marketplace is changing fast. That's my takeaway on retail right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think the discussion was quite lively. What I'd like to do following this meeting, probably early next week, is just reach out to each one of you and just see if we can have 15 minutes on the phone, just to let me know how this presentation was received by yourself, and also to see if there are potentially people who could benefit from a further, more detailed discussion, looking at what scenario planning is, looking at risks and how to better capture what risks there are out there, which might be important to the business, and then to perhaps paint out some kind of path towards actually implementing scenario planning, because it's one of the very few tools I've seen that will allow businesses to, you're not going to take control of the future, but you're going to have a better guide and direction towards how you're going to position yourself during this time to win, as opposed to just to survive. Because I don't think most businesses which have an aspiration of surviving barely, generate enough cash to pay the weekly payroll check, it is the right philosophy during this time. So I've got my contact details, and I'm just wondering if there's any other questions while we're together. I'm conscious of time pressing on. We've got probably a few minutes. If there's any other questions, anything I've said or would be helpful to explore.
Actually, Gary, I put one forth. I wouldn't mind getting some feedback or reaction from the others on what they think of the in this current disrupted landscape, retail landscape, how that 80-20 Pareto's principle is going to, I guess, operate going forward. How do we see that? I mean, for the last, I don't know, at least 60 years, that's pretty much been it. And the focus has been there. If you've been running a business, a well-oiled machine, but going forward, I don't know, does it apply the same way? Does it have the same impact? You have a question there? Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, you've got a whole bunch of issues. Perhaps we should take that offline. I think we should perhaps have a chat early next week and just try and explore some of that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, if we're not exploring on LinkedIn as we do. So if there are no other questions, and I'd like to just wrap up the session and thank you all for attending, and look forward to perhaps touching base with you during next week or two, and seeing how this presentation was received, and if it sparked any thoughts as to other companies that might benefit from the conversation.
That's perfect. Thank you, Gary.
That's good. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.